Thank you very much to everyone and to Chairman Bilahari for this first session. And after this inaugural speech from Senior Minister Teo Chi-Yen, we will continue with our first panel regarding the ongoing strategic changes, be it in the Middle East, Asia, or in Europe and the US. So for the next hour and 10 minutes, we will be exploring the consequences of the new geopolitical competition in the Middle East and Asia. This has been a current theme of research and debates at the Middle East Institute. And since our last annual conference that took place in February of last year, we have seen many new developments in terms of regional arrangements. Some have already been mentioned, such as the announcement of the new alliance AUKUS between the US, Australia, and the UK, the strengthening of the Quad with Australia, Japan, and India, but the creation also of another Quad, the one in the Middle East, this time including India, the UAE, and Israel. We've seen also the consolidation of the so-called Abraham Accords, and most recently, the launching of the Negev Summit that is expected to become a new annual forum for Israel and the Arab states. This all evidences new patterns of security cooperations, but it comes along with new tensions and crises as well. We have seen the US getting more and more nervous about the cooperation of its Gulf partners with China. And lately, when Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine, those same Gulf partners refused to fully align themselves on the position of Washington. So, as mentioned by Senior Minister Teo Chi-Yen, the geopolitical competition is getting more polarized, more volatile, and more complex. The question then becomes, how can states in the Middle East and Asia keep cooperating with all the sides involved without getting trapped into that competition? So to unpack and discuss these questions, we invited three distinguished guests. First is Mr. Drew Thompson, who's a visiting senior research fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Prior to that, from 2011 to 2018, Mr. Thompson was the director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia in the Office of the US Secretary of Defense, where he was responsible for supporting the Secretary and managing military-to-military relations. He was also previously the director of China Studies at the Center for the National Interest and assistant director of the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Our second speaker will actually be talking from Washington in the middle of the night. So thank you very much for that, Ms. Yun Sun, who's a senior fellow and director of the China program and co-director of the East Asia program at the Stimson Center. Prior to that, she was a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, where she focused on Chinese national security decision-making process and China-Africa relations. She also worked as a China analyst for the International Crisis Group based in Beijing, specializing in China's foreign policy towards conflict countries and the developing world. Lastly, our third speaker will be Ambassador Shivshankar Menon. Ambassador Menon is currently visiting professor and chair of the Ashoka Center for China Studies at Ashoka University in India. He was previously India's National Security Advisor from 2010 to 2014, as well as Foreign Secretary from 2006 to 2009. Let me mention also that he wrote several books, including Choices Inside the Making of India Foreign Policy, published in 2016, and most recently, India and Asian Geopolitics, the Past, Present, which was published by Brookings Press in the US and Penguin Random House in India last year. Now, without further ado, I'll turn to our first speaker, Mr. Drew Thompson. Dear Drew, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean-Luc. I appreciate that very generous introduction. Let me start with a caveat that I'm not an expert on the Middle East or on China-Middle East relations. So I think part of this discussion is probably going to stretch my comfort zone. So I'll focus on US-China relations and explore some of the implications for Southeast Asia, and then I'll take some risk and extrapolate what it might mean for the Middle East. So I'll start with US-China relations and US-China competition, which really animates the discussion here in the region. I think the Biden administration came into office pretty much accepting the Trump administration's framework for China in terms of identifying the challenges that were posed by China's both foreign and domestic policy since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012. This framework, I think, is very much a bipartisan consensus in Washington, indicating that the current approach is here to stay for the foreseeable future. And I think it's also very grounded in national interests rather than party politics. But unlike the Trump administration, whose policies were somewhat ad hoc, unilateral, and frankly, rather chaotic, the Biden administration intended to craft a much more strategic and traditional approach to foreign policy, as well as competition with China. And it's focused really on three pillars. The first pillar is domestic revitalization, and that's containing COVID, passing the infrastructure bill, investing in U.S. technological and manufacturing competitiveness, increasing and creating a resilient supply chain, and really restoring faith in U.S. democratic institutions. And I think these are all things that the administration is working hard to achieve. Secondly, I think the Biden administration is very focused on and differentiating itself from the Trump administration by rejoining multilateral institutions and strengthening its relationships with partners and allies. As Jean-Luc just mentioned, the Biden administration rejoined the Paris Agreement, funded the WHO, and has embraced many of these multilateral dealings with global challenges. And while this is very much about China, it's also not. And I think that's important to recognize. The Biden administration elevated the Quad to a head of state level engagement. They've held 2 video and 1 in-person meetings, and the next in-person summit will occur on May 25th in Tokyo. And the Quad has really been tasked with dealing with global issues like the pandemic and climate change, and these really aren't China-specific issues. Other issues, of course, AUKUS, as you mentioned, and I think there's been or at least the hint that there'll be a reinvigorated trilateral U.S.-Japan ROK security relationship. There was a ministerial meeting in February, and I think there's the potential that it'll improve with the new government in Seoul. Obviously, the U.S. has done a great deal to invigorate the relationship with NATO. Russia certainly has contributed to that effort, but I think the Biden administration was first out of the blocks by lifting steel tariffs with European partners. So we've seen the strengthening of multilateral relationships. Certainly here in the region, we've seen deepening relationship with Japan, with Australia, and even the Philippines with the renewal of the Visiting Forces Agreement. I think that was a pretty big accomplishment. So these actions that the administration has taken is not entirely driven by competition with China. These achievements do bring the U.S. rather intrinsic benefits, and it's in the U.S. interest to pursue them regardless of China. But I think from China's perspective, there is a tendency to attribute the Biden administration's accomplishments and as well as the downturn in bilateral relations, essentially all to U.S. actions. And this is in many ways encapsulated in the Thucydides trap theory, where U.S. actions are a natural result of diminishing power and China's rise. And you hear it often articulated as, number one is opposing number two so that it can't become number one. But honestly, it's a trope, and I think patently it's quite false. The U.S. Is pursuing its interests, as I said, and even though China views the U.S. as reacting to China's growing influence, it's not the case. I think if you look at the Quad, for example, it's not about just China. Remember, it was formed in 2004 after the Boxing Day tsunami as a vehicle for improving the delivery of global public goods in the region. U.S. alliances around the region, likewise, were formed long before China's rise in the aftermath of World War II. So not everything the U.S. does is a response to China, despite the fact that Chinese officials put all the blame on the Biden administration for the downturn in the relationship. Unfortunately, what you're not hearing from China is what they might do differently to improve the bilateral relationship, either unilaterally or in response to offers that the U.S. might make to accommodate China more broadly, which of course disincentivizes the Biden administration from engaging China towards that particular end. So I think the third pillar really is the Biden administration's engagement with China. They've pursued, I think, rather intensive diplomacy with Chinese officials since the administration came into office. But the purpose of it is really to ensure that competition doesn't veer into conflict, what administration officials will informally refer to as guardrails. So basically keeping the relationship on a road and not letting it run off the tracks. So we've seen the Biden administration have high-level meetings in Alaska, Tianjin, Zurich, and Rome. We've seen 2 virtual meetings between Xi Jinping and President Biden. We've seen functional level meetings on climate change between John Kerry and Xie Jianhua. We've seen trade discussions between USTR Catherine Tai and State Councilor Liu He. We've seen Secretary Austin have a bilateral telephone or video exchange with the Defense Minister General Wei Fenghe back in April, and General Austin said that he expects to meet General Wei in Singapore next month at the Singapore Dialogue. So I think the objective of these engagements is about keeping the relationship in a safe space. It's not focused on pressing China to make fundamental changes to its political system at this point. Like many administrations before it, it's more focused on influencing China's behavior in the international system, essentially by building these robust partnerships with allies and partners. Previous administrations, the Obama administration, often referred to this as shaping China's choices. And the White House Indo-Pacific strategy that was released in February is also quite explicit about that. And it said that the objective is not to change the PRC, but to shape the strategic environment in which it operates. So why has there been such a dramatic change in bilateral relations? Well, there's I think a couple of factors, but I think Xi Jinping has fundamentally changed China. The Communist Party of China, the CPC, calls the period after 2012 the new era. And I think this affects the Biden administration's perspective, and it also informs its approach. The party, of course, now dominates all aspects of China's policy, its politics, its economy, its foreign policies, as well as China's society. Politically, power is now pretty much all concentrated in Xi Jinping's hands, and the party dominates, as they say, all things. In economics, we've seen basically the retrenchment of liberalizing economic reforms. We've seen the party leading, the market retreating, state-owned enterprises increasingly dominating the economy, and both SOEs and increasingly private companies also serving as tools or as actors on behalf of the state. And I think this is a pretty major factor in the deterioration of the U.S.-China relationship. U.S. officials consider China's mercantilist approach as discriminatory, and this includes a lack of reciprocal market access, which is something the Trump administration pushed very hard to achieve and was unsuccessful, rampant intellectual property theft, subsidies for state-owned enterprises, and this isn't reflected in programs such as Made in China 2025, the dual circulation concept, and these all affirm that China is either focused on decoupling from the outside world, or I think more accurately, maybe reducing its dependence on foreign markets and foreign partners, and at the same time, increasing those global partners' dependence on China for China's own benefit and leverage. On foreign policy, again, I think we've seen China become much more assertively globally since 2012 and Xi Jinping's rise. This has been both diplomatic and military. China's wolf warrior diplomacy. Wolf warrior is now a badge of honor for China's diplomats. And we've seen extensive use of the PLA as a tool of policy. We've seen military signaling. We've seen a lot of military exercises, particularly targeting Taiwan, as well as the United States. And we're now also facing a nuclear buildup in China that the US hasn't had to contend with before, at the same time that dialogue on nuclear strategic issues is very wanting. So what does China, or more accurately, the party, want to achieve in both Southeast Asia and the Middle East? I think there's many things, but I think I think we have to step back and sort of look at what are the party's primary interests, and they really are domestic and internal. They're centered around the party securing its own legitimacy, protecting the party from threats, and I think that's both within and external to the party. It's the achievement of what the party calls political security. If we look at diplomacy, foreign affairs, we look at the PLA and security affairs, I think this needs to be seen in that context. The Chinese bureaucracies are not what we used to call in the Pentagon a self-licking ice cream cone. These are not bureaucracies that support themselves, but these are integrated, integral functions of the party to secure itself and its interests both domestically and abroad. So China's foreign policies are also hierarchical. Managing great power relations is the top priority, followed by managing its close-in periphery, And then I think thirdly, it's essentially everything else. And Taiwan is central to that as both internal and on the periphery. It's central to the PLA's military modernization, the foreign ministry's diplomacy in all three tiers, and that makes it a really important lens through which to gauge and measure Chinese foreign policy, regardless of where it takes place. And I think if you're watching this from the Middle East and you think, wow, Taiwan's really not important or central to China's foreign policy, then I challenge you to list Taiwan as a country on your website and see what happens. But in all seriousness, these are the things that really drive and animate China's policy and strategy abroad. These are the core interests it seeks to protect. So in Southeast Asia, Southeast Asian states, as Senior Minister Teo just affirmed, they've been explicit about not wanting to choose sides between the US and China, and there's clearly concern about rising tensions in the US-China dyad. Small states in the region, I think both in the Middle East and potentially also in Southeast Asia and potentially also in the Middle East, I think they worry about trade dependency on China, China's quick trigger on using economic sanctions when countries defy it politically. And of course, quite rationally, countries don't want that to happen to them. So I think to some degree, Beijing and Washington both simultaneously seek to reassure Southeast Asian states that they're not forcing them to choose sides, even as they cajole or entice countries to share their vision for world order. I don't think either power is entirely successful. That's because countries throughout Southeast Asia are continuing to seek to maximize their benefits from both Beijing and Washington. They're encouraging both to invest more deeply in the region and hoping at the same time that Washington and Beijing can get along. So I'll wrap this up with a couple of sort of implications, what I think for the Middle East. And again, this is beyond my expertise to a large degree. I think that while the US is certainly focused on competition with China, I don't think the US sees the Middle East as a theater for competition with China, as the title of the conference implies. I just don't think so. I don't think that competition with China means that the US is somehow leaving the Middle East. It's not. US interests are intrinsic to the Middle East. They're independent of China, independent of US-China competition. US interests in the region long predate China's rise as an economic and military power. The US is going to continue to pursue its interests globally, including in the Middle East, even as it engages and competes with China at the same time. And sometimes that'll occur in the region, but most of the time I think it'll be outside, because Washington can definitely walk and chew gum at the same time. Again, remembering that China's primary focus is internal and on its periphery, a lot of this has to do with its core interests, and in many cases, you can use unification with Taiwan as an example, but there's plenty of others, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and again, regime security as well. So one of China's key goals in both, I think, the Middle East and Southeast Asia is to create seams between the US and its allies. A senior government official and intelligence analyst in Beijing once admitted that achieving the China dream of national rejuvenation, Xi Jinping's overarching goal, would necessarily include not just reunification with Taiwan, but also ending the US-Japan alliance. So I think that holds true across the US alliance network. So barring the dismantling of US alliances, I think Beijing would be satisfied in the interim with basically neutralizing them, pushing more US partners towards neutrality on the issues that Beijing cares about most, ensuring that US allies don't challenge China on their core interests, don't support the US on Beijing's core interest issues, such as the defense of Taiwan. You could see that playing out in a potential scenario where a Taiwan conflict results in the US trying to build a global coalition to enforce, say, sanctions against China. That would be a very difficult challenge for the US, whereas it may have been easier to gain a consensus within Europe on the sanction of Russia. China is an entirely different beast altogether. So whether or not Beijing is successful in separating the US from its allies or simply neutralizing them on the issues it cares about, I don't think Beijing ultimately expects them to defy Washington outright, choose sides. Whether China is successful in creating such a paradigm of neutral states, non-interference in what they consider their internal affairs, this might be referred to as a multipolar world. I think this is an open question. In some cases, it already exists. I think it's highly unlikely that there would be a world coalition to, say, sanction China in the event of some egregious violation of existing international norms. But in many cases, it's also worth remembering that paradigm, I think, existed long before Xi Jinping came into power. So I think this goal of China is perhaps less a factor of China's ability, China's policies, and Xi Jinping's power, and maybe more a factor of the Middle Eastern and Southeast Asian states' pursuit of their own interests, their desire to maintain their agency, as well as their autonomy as they pursue these interests through balancing strategies between the US and Washington. So I think I've probably come up to my time, and I'll stop there, but happy to discuss more in the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thompson. Let me turn right away to Yoon Soon for our second briefing. Floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saman, and thanks to Ambassador Bilahari for the invitation to be on this panel. I know it's 4 a.m. in Washington. I'll try to say something smart about China's policy and also the overall context of the China's relationship with Middle East and what it means for the U.S.-China strategic competition. First, I agree with Drew. I think he captured the current state of U.S.-China relations really well. I'll just say that for the year of 2022, the trajectory of deterioration between Beijing and Washington did not reverse. In fact, it has accelerated. Which is quite different from the expectation of Beijing before 2022. So China had expected or had hoped that Biden administration's policy would show some positive sign or some reversal of the China policy from the Trump era. And in 2022, I think the original Chinese hope was that, well, maybe the deterioration could stop, maybe not reversed, but for this negative trajectory, it could slow down. But what they have realized since the beginning of the war in Ukraine is that the bilateral relations between China and the U.S. in fact has gotten even worse than before the war broke out. From the war, I think the Chinese draws the conclusion that the U.S. is trying to shape up a bipolar world power structure with China and Russia on the one pole, and the U.S. and the rest of the world, especially with its allies and partners, will be the other pole. And this is quite different from the power balance or the structure that China is hoping to shape from the war in Ukraine. And what Beijing has wanted is with US and Russia being the two poles or being the two confrontational powers. But then China and a large number of developing countries could be a relatively neutral third pole to counterbalance both US and Russia. How the power structure will come out of the war in Ukraine, I think it still remains to see. But at least in terms of the Middle Eastern countries, especially for countries that currently have some challenge in terms of the relationship with the United States, I think it's not hard to see that there are certain common perspectives between these countries and China on the issue of Russia. So it could even be said that the war in Ukraine has interestingly created convergence between China and some of the key players in the Middle East in their diplomatic positioning. As the war has forced the countries to make their choice on Russia, China and some Middle Eastern countries found themselves to be on the same side. This is particularly evident in their voting records at the 3 UN resolutions in the past 2+ months. So on February 26th, the UN Security Council voted on the resolution that would have demanded that Moscow immediately stop its attack on Ukraine and withdraw all troops. 3 members of the UN Security Council abstained, including both China and UAE. Then on March March 2nd, UN General Assembly voted on a motion to demand an immediate end to the invasion of Ukraine. China, Iran, and Iraq are among the 35 countries abstained again. Then on April 7th, UN General Assembly voted on the resolution to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council. It saw a much longer list of Middle Eastern countries abstaining from the voting, including Egypt, Saudi, UAE, Jordan, Qatar, Kuwait, and Iraq. China voted against the April 7 resolution, although neither was able to prevent the resolution from being adopted. So these records reveal a somewhat inconvenient truth, that is, China and some of the key allies and partners of the United States share probably a little bit more common positions on Russia and the war in Ukraine than people realize. About the competition between US and China in the Middle East, I think that's currently still an emerging issue, but we are seeing signs and indicators of this competition deepening and also expanding, such as in the case of UAE, in the case of Saudi Arabia. But I think the discussion about this issue also depends on which perspective that we're looking at. So do we view the region from the lens or through the lens of US-China strategic competition, or will view the region, just look at China's relationship with Middle East more organically instead of from the competitive prism? Because if we look at the relationship, just purely the relationship between China and the Middle East, the fact is Middle East is not the main or primary economic partner of China. If we look at the data, for example, from 2019, trade with Middle East is only 7% of China's global total. And the investment towards Middle East is somewhere around, in terms of the stock, is 1.2% of China's global total. In terms of the infrastructure, the contract service, Middle East is higher on China's global total, somewhere around 14%. And then looking at the arms sales that China has towards Middle East is relatively important. It's 23% of China's global total. And the most important aspect, of course, is energy trade. And China's dependence on imported crude oil is as high as 70%. And 47 of that crude import comes from Middle East. So if you look at the strategic importance of Middle East for China economically, which is still remains one of the key aspects of China's foreign relations. So three aspects, Middle East is important for China. The one that people talk most about is energy, but it's also followed by service contracts that Chinese contractors obtain in the Middle East, as well as arms sales. But because energy is regarded as a critical strategic issue for China's economic security, so therefore Middle East, the role is quite evident. But if we look at the economic relations with China from a Middle East perspective, I think the importance of China has been climbing up. So, like for example, trade with China is about 13% of the region's global total. And the crude oil export to China is around 31% of the region's global total. Service contracts fulfilled by China around 18%, so that's quite relevant. And arms sales, well, China is really a pretty minor player coming to the arms purchase from the region. Like for example, from 2011 to 2015, China's arms sales to Middle East is about 2.8% of the region's global purchase. From 2015 to 2019, China's market share actually decreased to about 2%. So it really depends on the reference point. That are we comparing it to China's previous engagement, and we see a positive trajectory? But if you look at the percentage of Middle East in terms of China's global economic engagement, that percentage, whether it's growing or is decreasing, that's also an intriguing question. I would say that in terms of the economic engagement, that there is a recognition in China that the Western countries, United States and Europe, still has advantage in the Middle East region. That if you look at the upstream of economic activities, such as energy exploration, finance, insurance, consulting and investment, China is not yet the primary or the biggest player in the region. But because the region, the importance of China and the Middle East for each other has been growing, we are seeing that China also has demonstrated a growing interest in political involvement in the region. And that also needs to be qualified, that we just look at the trajectory of political relations between China and the Middle East itself, or we make it a comparative study and look at how the US influence in the region is still, I would say, the most important external player for the region. And this is something that the Chinese learned a very hard lesson from the Abraham Agreement, the Middle East Peace Accord that Trump administration orchestrated. Because before the peace accord came into being, I think the overall assessment in the Chinese policy community is that while US is trying to pull out of the region, and the US is decreasing its strategic involvement and also its commitment and its commitment to the region. But the important lesson that China learned from the Abraham Agreement is that despite the image and the perceptions that US is pulling out of the Middle East, US still enjoys the most influence in the region. And there's no other countries that can pull something like this together except the United States. So therefore, we see that China is expanding its influence, its economic relations with different countries in the region. And also China is trying to at least rhetorically play a bigger role in the peace and mediation, peace and conflict issues in the region. But so far, I think when people come to define China's relationship with Middle East, some of the key words are transactional relationship, detached approach, that China is not bogging itself down to commitment to either side of the many conflicts that we see in the region, which has allowed China the balancing diplomacy. We see that between Israel and Palestine. We see that between Iran and Saudi. We also see that in terms of the issues, for example, in Yemen, the issues in Syria. So balancing diplomacy is still something that the Chinese are trying to strike in the region. And for the longest time, China was able to get a free ride with the United States because of the regional security architecture has been primarily mandated, managed and guaranteed by the United States. So as China deepens its ties in the region, how long is balancing diplomacy could continue without China picking a side or making commitment, and in what format? I think that still remains to be seen. So I will stop there, Dr. Saman, and I look forward to Ambassador Mainen's insights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me actually turn to Ambassador for the final presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for asking me. Actually, what I'm going to say is probably a mirror image of what Yunsun was saying just now. What I thought I'd do is partly address the framing of the way this has been posed in the program, then say a little bit about India and China's presence in the Middle East or footprint in the Middle East, and lastly, draw a few conclusions. I'm not really sure whether we can actually frame what India and China are doing in the Middle East as an India-China game. Is there an India-China game in West Asia? Perhaps, but if there is, it's not a zero-sum game. And let me try and explain why I say that. India's approach to the region since 1947 has really been to pursue its own security interests in West Asia on a bilateral and transactional basis, separately with each country. And it's built a reputation as a sort of non-prescriptive, non-intrusive, not getting involved in intra-regional disputes, whether it's Shia Sunni, Iran, Saudi, Israel, Iran, the role of Muslim Brotherhood, whether it's Yemen, Syria, etc. So India's stance, therefore, has been to try and stay clear of the internal partisan politics, partly for the opposite reason of China, because historically, India has been part of a political, economic, and cultural continuum in Southwest Asia, stretching from the Nile to the Ganges. And and security, prosperity, politics, language, religion were linked across this region to an extent with India, much more. I don't think China could say the same, except maybe for Xinjiang, which is now part of China. And therefore, India didn't want its domestic politics to be involved and get involved in what was happening in the region. So India then worked with all the regional powers. And because it tried this non-prescriptive transactional bilateral approach, it managed to work with all of them, whether India and Saudi Arabia have been strategic partners since 2010. Interestingly, the effect of the Mumbai attacks in 2008 was to actually create a shared understanding of threat between India, Saudi, the GCC, and others. And at the same time, India has worked on defense and security with Israel for many decades, and it's maintained a working relationship with Iran on several issues where both sides have congrats. And Prime Minister Modi has actually done this, in fact, outdone his predecessors in terms of the frequency of his personal contact, his visits to Israel, dehyphenating India's relations with Israel from those with Palestine, and recently entering into FTAs with the UAE and remaking economic relations. But to my mind, this is not an India-China competition. India is not in the Middle East because of China. India is there because she's always been there and she has a whole set of interests. And if you look at the footprint, it's very different. Look at India's footprint. By 2020, over 8 million Indians were living and working in the Gulf, 3 million of them in Saudi Arabia. Indians are the largest expatriate community in every GCC country, and the majority community in 3 countries, Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE. The GCC is much more important to India than it says, say, to China. It's India's principal source of oil imports, 40%. Trade, India GCC was $121 billion in 2018-19, which was the 3rd largest among all the trade groupings with which India trades, more than India-ASEAN trade in that year. So for energy security, and of course for security and other counterterrorism, other issues as well. And the further afield you go, there are still very strong commercial and other interests. Defense relationship with Israel, for instance, fertilizer with Jordan. And since 2005, India has been actually entering into defense, security, other arrangements with countries like Qatar, like Saudi Arabia, and these are gaining weight. So China's footprint is very different. Both have energy security interests in common, I would say, but China's forte is different. It's big infrastructures and ports, is in what the BRI was trying to do, weapons exports, bases along the east coast of Africa, and of course the defensive interests in Xinjiang. But has all this changed with the Quad 2, which you mentioned in your introduction? I don't think so. Quite frankly, this Quad 2, whose foreign ministers met, Israel, US, UAE, India, it's set up a working group to see what it can do together on trade, climate change, energy, maritime security. This is no well thought out US strategy to contain China. I mean, frankly, there are uncertainties. We're still waiting for a definitive statement of the Biden administration's China policy. But quite apart from that, to speak of the Quad 2 as containing China is absurd. When every West Asian state, including the members of Quad 2, have the closest possible ties with China, are enthusiastic participants in the BRI. Israel has an innovative comprehensive partnership with China since 2017. The UAE has a comprehensive strategic partnership with China since 2018, which is the highest level of ties China has with anyone except Russia. There's no real strategic intent or interest binding the Quad 2. Israel may want it to confront Iran. The US may want it to confront China, but it's unlikely to do either, to my mind. So could there be an India-China competition in the classical geopolitical sense in the future? There are signs of a changing sort of Chinese footprint in the region. July, August 2020, New York Times, Iranian media reported 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership between Iran and China, and which included $400 billion of Chinese investment in Iran's energy sector, defense industry, etc. Talks of links with Gwadar and Chabahar, of extending the China-Pakistan economic corridor. All that would change. And China has, I think, in recent times taken slightly clearer stance on political issues. But so far, at a time when BRI itself is facing stress and almost certainly remodeling, I would suspend judgment right now about whether we are about to see some kind of classic geopolitical competition between the two. Besides, India and China have common interests in West Asia. Energy security is clear, security of the sea lanes, which bring that oil to India, to China. And I would say even the security and stability of the regimes in the Gulf and in Iran. Whether India's interest is more or less than China's, all that we can argue, but there is a common interest there, which I think we need to look at. So where does all this go? You know, the US might indeed urge India to a more active role as she herself rebalances her security commitments. But if India changes the pattern of her involvement in West Asia, attempting to become a net provider of security, for instance, it will be for her own reasons, because of Indian interests which drive her to do so. So I wouldn't actually see this as part of some response to US-China contention or as a big triangle. Of course, regional middle powers in West Asia will use China-US contention to get what they can from both parties. But for the present, China's reach into West Asia is primarily economic, and she's not a security alternative to the US. Nor is India-China rivalry in West Asia such that they are in direct contention, opening space for local powers to play one off against the other. This could change. I mean, there's over time, as global and West Asian futures become more uncertain and contentious and India's interests expand, it seems to me that you know, whether India decides to become a net provider of security, starts playing a more systemic role in regional issues as the US withdraws, will only become clear later. I don't think we've got to that stage yet. The difference, of course, is that India has huge bilateral stakes in each of these relationships, the diaspora to protect and so on. For China, the Middle East or West Asia is part of a broader calculus which stems from her regional global ambitions and her periphery, which is a slightly different calculus. So in a sense, it's not inevitable that India and China will end up rubbing up against each other in the Middle East. To my mind, actually, India and China are more likely to first rub up against one another in the Indian Ocean island nations, rather than in the Gulf or West Asia, because in the island nations, actually, the picture is much more mixed, and there is already a level of India-China competition. I think people often forget that the UAE frequently outpaces China, India, and the US in both imports and exports to these countries. And new players like Qatar, Turkey are likely to join the fray. So for me, actually, I don't think we are today in a situation where we should frame issues in the Middle East in terms of India-China competition, certainly. It could come. And that's why this qualified sort of answer to the question that the program posed. I'll stop there and look forward to the questions and to hearing what the others have to say.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you to the three of you for these words. We have about 25 minutes for Q&A. Let me tell our participants that if you'd like to ask a question, please write it down in the Q&A box in the Zoom application. And while we receive the first questions, let me take the privilege of being the moderator to ask maybe a general question and one maybe more specific Ambassador Menon. I mean, listening to the three of you, I had the impression, which is quite clear, that each of you emphasized the idea that there is no real interest, no desire, basically from the US, from China, or from India, to turn the Middle East into an area of competition. But having said that, and maybe because at the Middle East Institute, we tend to look at these topics from the Middle East, what you see from the region is countries such as Israel, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, more and more feeling the pressure, especially from their closest partner, the US, to take a side. They feel the pressure when they start signing agreements with Chinese companies, either with the Haifa port in Israel or Khalifa port in the UAE. And one major interesting development in the last year was the unraveling of the F-35 negotiations with the US and the UAE. Initially, everyone was thinking that if there's an issue with the sale of a fighter jet to the UAE, this will be about Israel. That was a classic topic in the Middle East. And the Abraham Accords was supposed to neutralize that issue. What we've seen is that actually the major problem was not Israel, it was actually UAE-China relations, in particular speculations about a Chinese military construction in Abu Dhabi. So one question I have is how inevitable actually this competition is going to be for the Middle East. How do you see countries in the region trying to have it maybe both ways, to maintain good ties with the US, but at the same time diversify with China? Because on their side, probably they don't want to see the competition. They are fine with it, but what they see is more and more pressures actually to accept, to acknowledge that competition. So how do we make a clear policy message here? Seen, I would say, maybe from Washington. And Ambassador, regarding India, one thing which I find very interesting is in the last, I'd say 5-6 years, we've seen that clearly with Narendra Modi, there was a momentum for closer ties with Gulf states, and in particular with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But as I just mentioned, that came at the same time that there was also momentum for closer Gulf-China relations. And in some ways, these Gulf-China relations, and in particular for UAE, are becoming more strategic, more military, more security-oriented than with India. So I'm just asking, maybe playing the devil's advocate here, but trying to wonder how far can you see India's rapprochement with Gulf countries if you have at the same time that security, that strategic dimension for the Gulf-China rapprochement? How far can we go with these two parallel rapprochement in a way? So I leave it to the three of you to answer this, maybe more comments than questions. Can I maybe turn to Drew for the first remarks?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot there. What just sort of reflecting on these comments, I'm a little surprised at how much the three panelists are in agreement, as we each frame it in a very different way about the prospects for whether it's a theater of competition or an arena for competition. Essentially, the Middle East has agency and has its own interests, and each of these countries have an interest in building their relationship. As Ambassador Menon said, not everything is a zero-sum game, and not everything is a gladiator fight, even if that's what people want to see in some cases. I think we shouldn't underestimate. We shouldn't underestimate the marketing efforts of academics to make their conferences compelling. But I think at the same time, we have to look at the behaviors of each of the parties in their own interest. So on the F-35 deal, again, I'm not privy to what the internal deliberations were. I mean, having worked on arms sales issues for many years, it's highly political. highly complicated, many more factors than you could possibly imagine if you're not sort of inside the bureaucracy. And it runs the gamut, and the number of vetoes in the system are considerable, running from foreign disclosure, security protection type people who are looking at proliferation of technology or the threat that technology could be lost. So these are very technical people making essentially policy decisions about the risk of U.S. Compromise of U.S. technology or proliferation. I mean, that alone can be enough to stop any discussion, and I've seen it in discussions with close allies, where if the U.S. service that provides that weapon system doesn't have confidence that either the country receiving it can protect it or that there's a risk of proliferation, you never get to the political decision in the trade space. But as you go through that process, you then get to the more political elements, which can involve the interagency discussion. In the case of the UAE, clearly using the F-35 sale at one point as political leverage to achieve the Abraham Accords. I mean, that's coercive diplomacy and a fairly normal tool in economic toolkits. But then you get into the political aspect that's beyond the administration, and you get into Congress, you get into things like support for Israel, and all of those things can affect the decision. I think if you look at the reporting, and again, I have no inside knowledge. There's a lot of speculation that this somehow has to do with China, and that may be the case. But I'd note that the U.S. and Iraq, for example, had U.S. Contractors, U.S. military equipment on the same base with Chinese contractors and PLA provided equipment that the Iraqis were operating side by side on a single base. So as long as those conditions where, now this is not F-35s and the U.S. most advanced fifth generation technology, this is in some case very different technology that's in close proximity to one another, but U.S. concerns, for example, in Turkey, where the U.S. was concerned that a Russian supplied S-400 radar system and missile defense system could be used essentially as an intelligence collection platform against the U.S. most advanced fighter plane in current production. That's a deal breaker, and it has less to do with politics than it does about simply protecting U.S. technology and the critical edge that it has, and not having it be transferred to adversaries. So I caution any effort to sort of without good knowledge applying this sort of concern that maybe the UAE is getting too close to China and therefore the U.S. Is suddenly punitive. There's lots of examples where the U.S. and China can coexist in third countries in close proximity. Djibouti is another good example. There's actually occasionally communications between the two bases. In the past, there have been discussions between them about how to make sure that you've got professional behaviors between the U.S. and China when operating in close proximity. And we've also seen similar experience with Russia in Syria, for example. There's a long tradition and history of the U.S. and Russia, despite their deep political differences, coexisting in the security space, having common understandings, confidence building measures, communication protocols to prevent what the military calls deconfliction, not having two capabilities in the same place at the same time. So I think it's easy to look at this and say, there's a gladiator fight and this is entertaining for everybody, but not everything in foreign policy and in geopolitics is bread and circus.
Thank you. Let me turn to Yun in DC.
Thank you, Dr. Saman. First on the issue of Middle Eastern countries or any middle powers that has to choose between U.S. and China. I think all the three, I agree that all three of us seems to be on the same page, because when great powers coexist in the region, it's very difficult for them not to have overlapping interests. Like, for example, or overlapping interest on overlapping issues. China maintains a relatively close relationship compared to other great powers with Iran, and that relationship itself has a significant impact over the United States. And UAE in recent years has basically emerged as a country in the region that has the closest tie with China, and that inevitably raises question on technical issues like you just mentioned. Although I would say that the issue of arms sales or U.S. opposition to arms sales by countries in the Middle East to or technology sharing with China is not a new issue either. That as early as 1992, when China was trying to purchase the Falcon early warning system from Israel, the U.S. opposition back then played a major role blocking that transaction. So this was 1992. China was not even the player it is today. So I would say that the issue has a pretty long history too. And as for the position of the countries that's being put in between U.S. and China, I'm a ardent fan of Ambassador Bilahari's agency theory, which is that, well, like you just mentioned, this type of situation does afford middle powers or smaller countries in the middle the agency, but it does dictate that the countries involved will have to be active. We'll have to actively calibrate, actively engage, actively deliberate, and actively picking a side or choosing a side on different issues based on the merit of the issue. Like Singapore is not picking US side or China's side. Singapore is picking Singapore's side, right? And I think that is a position that's respected by both US and China. A few words on China's relationship with Gulf states. I think the 25-year agreement that China signed with Iran back in 2021 does have a critical impact over the mentality or the calculation of Gulf states, because we talked about the balancing diplomacy that China tries to strike between Iran and Arab countries and Gulf states, but this 25-year long-term cooperation agreement is believed to have offset that balance. So to bring this relationship a little bit more back to its balanced state, I think there is also the need from Gulf states to reach out to China and also to enhance their mechanism or enhance their strategic relationship. So I would say that balancing is not just one-sided by China. I think countries in the region also have to perceive and calculate China's relationship, for example, with Iran, and the strategic implications for the Gulf states. And the result that we're seeing, like for example, the Gulf foreign ministers visiting China basically around the same time in January, and the discussion about the free trade agreement with China is a reflection of the effort to restore this balance. Thank you.
Ambassador.
I actually agree with what's been said before. You know, when we say that countries don't want to see competition, I'm not sure that's true. That's what they say, but that's not how they act. They say it because they're expected to say that. But where does their agency come from for other countries? It comes from that competition. And the purpose of their policy is to increase their options, is to improve their options, create more options. And that actually comes out of an active diplomacy in a situation where there are several contenders. So yes, but I don't think that the Middle East is the larger powers' preferred theater for that competition, because none of them feels quite confident of being able to prevail. Each one picks naturally a ground which suits them best. And the Middle East is not, so far at least, anything but an area where the security architecture has been dominated and determined by the US and the West and the relationship of the Middle Eastern countries. But the Middle Eastern countries are clearly looking for more options. As Yunsun rightly said, when you look at their voting patterns in the UN, it's quite clear that what they're trying to do is to create space for themselves. And they will use whatever competition they can see, whether it's China, US, if India and China decide to get into a competition in the Middle East, which I don't see today. But if they do, yes, I'm sure they'd be happy to use it. They'll keep saying, isn't this terrible? But they'll use it, as Southeast Asia has done for so well and successfully for so long. States are not monogamous. You know, I think we have to remember that. And I think everybody involved is realistic enough to understand that. So when you said that, oh, but China's relations with the Gulf countries are more strategic than what, say, Modi has done in the last few years, perhaps, as I said, both China and India have very different footprints and very different strengths that they bring to these relationships. And India works to her strengths, which is the diaspora, which is the economic linkage, and which is a whole host of other things, some of which China doesn't have. But what China has is the capacity to build infrastructure, to sell weapons, which she manufactures herself, and she uses those. So I think you're going to see that both in parallel, and it's not an either-or situation for either China or for India. And certainly India and China have enough other serious problems to discuss without adding contention in the Middle East to their bilateral agenda. So I think, once again, you're finding all three of us very similar in our approach.
Yes, I must say I'm impressed by the level of
we didn't
agreement.
Coordinate, by the way.
Yes, I was going to say for the record, there was no coordination. So it's even more impressive, the level of the level of agreement, let's say, between our speakers. We have a few minutes left, so I'll give you two questions, and we'll see if we have time for more. We have one from Tatsuo Shikata on the Q&A box that you can see, one which is specifically for Ambassador Menon regarding the Quad, the initial Quad, not the Middle East Quad. And if I summarize the question, that relates to the agenda, the scope of the missions assigned to the Quad. And specific question being, can we speculate on a role of the Quad in the Middle East? Can you see influence of the Quad and India's role in that context, which relates to some of the comments actually that you made during your own speech on the Middle East Quad, the one that was established earlier this year. So that's the first question. I had another question, a general question for everyone, which relates to energy, and which is one question from my colleague, Ambassador Georgi Bustin at the Institute. He's asking, can an energy crunch, if there's an energy crunch, could we imagine a scenario of India and China competing for Middle East hydrocarbons? Can we speculate on competition between both countries for energy supplies coming from the region? So I suggest we start with you, Ambassador, on the question about the Quad, and then everyone, if you have any thoughts on the question about energy scenario. Thank you.
On the Quad question, I think the Indo-Pacific Quad, I think, there was a first attempt in 2007-8, which then didn't go very far. It was revived in 2015, but its function is not just China related. I think China would like to act as if it is purely an instrument to contain China and is a nation, NATO, and so on. They've changed their mind about it. Originally, they used to dismiss it as froth on the waves or something, but now suddenly it's become useful as an object, as a straw man to set up. But to my mind, the real strength of the Quad in the Indo-Pacific is that what it tries is to shape the larger environment. So it's not just maritime security, and it's not just China related, but it's also the provision of public goods, of vaccines, of resilient supply chains, I mean, if you look at the agenda that the Quad is developing for itself, it's much broader in the Indo-Pacific. But it's also an agenda that just the four countries can't do on their own. So they will have to work with others. They're talking to South Korea, they're talking to Indonesia, talking to Singapore, talking to the others. And I think it will be a much looser and therefore much more effective organization. This Quad 2 in the Middle East, I'm not quite sure. I don't see a unifying strategic purpose behind it. I don't see a sense of where it's going. You know, I mentioned what it's supposed to be doing, climate change and trade, and these are wonderful ideas, but what it's going to do and how it's going to do that and how this particular group somehow feel they can do it and what capabilities they have, I remain to be convinced. I mean, I'll wait. On the energy question, I think India, China, conceivably, yes, we could be competing, but this is an old situation. I mean, we've dealt with it in many ways. In fact, long ago, India and China were two countries who went in and invested in oil, not just prospecting, but actually drilling and extraction in places like Sudan, where nobody else would go. We have a common interest actually in the security of the sea lanes, which bring this oil to us. I mean, the four biggest consumers of the oil that goes through Hormuz are China, Japan, India, South Korea. And frankly, they share an interest, which is why all of them participated in anti-piracy off the Horn of Africa in the Gulf of Aden, for instance. So it seems to me that it's more than just, again, not a zero-sum game. It's not just India competing with China for scarce resources. I think it's also how can both of them manage the market and work with others to make sure that there is a steady, reasonable supply of oil at a reasonable price for us and do what we can for them. It's the same thing in fertilizers. The two biggest importers of fertilizers in the world are India and China. And you've seen what's happened to fertilizer prices after Ukraine. So these are issues on which actually we have a common interest. And in the past, India and China have actually talked to each other and coordinated their actions and seen what they can do to further their common interests, which I think is the way it should be. So it's not just pure competition or pure cooperation. I think it's a mix, which these are countries which are capable of doing. They're capable of actually managing something like that.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Drew and Jan, would you like to add something as we have now to finish the panel? This would be the final words.
I'll just add, Drew, you go first.
Okay. Certainly, Yunsun can have the last word. I love the energy question. It's a great one. And I'm reminded maybe almost 15 years ago, I gave a lecture at China's National Defense University. And a colonel in the class got up at the back of the room and asked a provocative question. He said, and this is 15 years ago, so we're talking early 2000s, Hu Jintao period. And he said, China and the US are going to go to war. And he just sort of went on with his question. And I said, you know, Colonel, I want you to elaborate. What makes you think that we're going to end up at war? Why is this so inevitable? And he said, because of energy. China's economy is growing. Our demand for energy is growing. We're going to need more, and more is in the Middle East. And you already lock it up. It's all your energy, and we're going to need it, and we're going to fight over it. And I pushed back on the concept, and you know, for me, it kind of reveals an insight into Chinese national security thinking. And it's also captured in the Malacca dilemma, right? China's fear and distrust of global markets that it doesn't control or fully understand. Ambassador Menon mentioned, you know, the rush to lock up equity oil, to rush to vertical integration, to drop new wells in places like Sudan that are politically risky. This is a sign of insecurity, and we see that a lot in Chinese strategic planning. We see that in the building of the gas and oil pipelines in Sittwe in Myanmar that then pump all that energy uphill a long way, all the way to Kunming, producing essentially very expensive energy rather than, but China's willing to pay that premium on very expensive transportation costs to provide it with security and energy resources for its Western provinces. So ideally, an energy crunch, if everybody has faith and buys into global markets, it should result in rising prices. Rising prices then should result in things like natural gas becoming more competitive, more investments in energy efficiency, in climate technologies, carbon reduction, renewable energy, electric vehicles, all of those things, right? So in an optimistic world, rising energy prices actually probably benefits climate change politics and policy if we accept it and embrace it and don't try to release energy from our national strategic stockpiles and start investing in things like creating an efficient engine. Minister Teo, talked about Singapore's efforts to become essentially a green gas station for the world. Yeah, ammonia, which is potentially generated from natural gas or from other sources that creates a green fuel for the world's shipping fleets and ultimately for the world's navies. These are the sorts of technologies that will result from an energy crunch, an oil crunch that produces higher prices, that then makes all of these other new technologies that are climate friendly much more feasible. So I think we're a long way from having this kind of mindset in places like China, which is very suspicious of anything outside the party. It's a very Marxist view of the world. And it's not just the United States they're suspicious of, or Europe, hostile Western forces. It's just anything not in the party within China as well. Hence all of the social controls and censorship. So again, an energy crunch isn't potentially a disaster or an inflationary device. It's really an opportunity to really solidify investments that will make the world more stable and more sustainable for the future. So I'll stop there and happy to have Yun Sun have the last word.
Thank you, Ju. We always love a Chinese anecdote from provoking Chinese policy wonks, and especially when those policy wonks come from PLA. And the level of bluntness almost carries I don't know how to describe the sense of childish innocence, like this is what we want and this is how we're going to get it. And you wonder about the level of sophistication and nuances in the policy deliberation process. I fully agree with Ju on the issue of energy diversification, or at least the Chinese desire to diversify their energy transportation routes and also their energy sources, which is why if you look at, China's energy relationship with Russia, I think the Chinese have tried very deliberately to avoid a situation of overdependence or unilateral dependence on Russia. And that's why I think China is trying to diversify its source of energy resources. I think the Chinese has become more confident about market, about basically if the Chinese energy trade is a transactional behavior, then China might be susceptible to the potential disruption to the supply, but it's not vulnerable because the market will always offer China as a buyer the resources that China would need. And I agree with Ambassador Manon on the issue between China and India. I don't see their relationship coming to the Middle East energy, crude oil or natural gas trade as competitive. In fact, there's more converging interest rather than diverging interest. And for my recent memory, at least in two cases, China and India were put on the same side. And in terms of their energy trade with problematic trading partners. And the one example was 2012 on the issue of Iran, that US was pushing for both China and India to decrease their crude oil import from Iran. And in order to qualify for the national security waiver, both China and India had to cut their oil trade. And currently, I think Russia is another example where the energy trade with Russia for both China and India have been put under scrutiny. So I would say that they probably have more converging interests rather than competitive interest coming to energy trade. But still, for the long run, I think the long-term trajectory of China's demand for fossil fuel is going to decrease. China is trying to achieve the carbon peak by 2035 and then carbon neutrality by 2060. So if you look at the long-term trend, I would say that the dependence on Middle East energy resources for China in the long run is going to be a downward trajectory, not upward. So that will have significant impact for the relationship that they already forged. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the three of you. We have to stop here, given the time constraint, and my apologies to the participants that didn't have the possibility to ask their questions. As I said, thank you to our three panelists. Special thank you to Yun-Sun, who did this panel in the middle of the night in DC. This was a great conversation, and this is a transition for the next panel that will actually be specifically looking at trade. So let me now turn to my colleague, Clemens Shea, who's going to moderate the next panel. Floor is yours, Clemens.